Well, let's now have our first conversation for the day as we focus on matters arising following the proposals and recommendations from governors to the presidency over the state of the Nigerian economy. Many reactions from the business community have trailed the 33 points recommendations by governors to the President Muhammadu Buhari-led administration. For some, the issues raised, though valid, are rather too much of a tall order for the presidency to tackle, and especially at a time when the momentum is building towards the 2023 elections. The time element, according to this school of thought, cannot be ignored, as some have described this communications as poorly timed and should have come earlier at the start of the second term of the administration. For others, school of thought are supporting the recommendation. There is never a late time to begin to decisively address the fragility of the Nigerian economy, as this would also set the pace for new government coming in next year. So far, the recommendations cover both monetary and fiscal directions towards more effective and efficient public finance management and administration, which investors are keeping a keen eye as to how this will translate to more robust recovery from the frail state of the economy. Well, joining me via Zoom to look at the matters arising following this recommendation and, of course, proposal from the governors to the presidency. I have Mr. Taiwo Oyedele. He's a fiscal policy partner, an Africa tax leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much for your time. Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you very much, Tolu. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Great. I'm sure you listened to my introduction, and I'll pick my first question from that introduction. Is it like it's better late than never? Many expected that we've been in this situation for some time, and the governors ought to have come up with all of these recommendations, maybe working hand in hand with the economic team. We have less than a year to wrap up this administration's, the governors, and for even the president, and we are coming up with all of this 33 recommendations. How does this come to you?
Thank you very much, Tolu. So this was very interesting to me. I have to be honest that I was not expecting it. I was not expecting it because I do know that there are structures in place for governors to interact with the federal government and share their perspective, particularly the NEC, the National Economic Commission, where you have all the 36 governors, you have even the CBN governor, you have the vice president sharing it, so they can as well just all these recommendations and follow up, in terms of implementation. So I wasn't expecting that governors would advise in a format that is more associated with the organized private sector, right? Maybe Manufacturer Association of Nigeria, SCCI, NASG. So those are the people who would normally advise like that and put it out. Almost Nigerians, so they have the right to advise government, but they're also part of government. So in a way, timing for me too, I'm curious as to why it's coming now, because not only is it that the federal government is counting down, many of the governors as well are going to be leaving office very soon and will not have the opportunity to stand for re-election because they have served the 2 terms. But if you look beyond, the method or the format of the advice, and you also look beyond the timing, you would also then have to interrogate the scope of the coverage of the advice. So it tends to focus a lot on fiscal and monetary, and not a lot around issues affecting the people, right? Issues around what's going on with ASU, what's going on with the education sector in general, what's going on with our youth, what's going on with unemployment, what's going on with Nigeria's economic plan. So these broader issues seem not to have been able to attract the attention of the governors. But overall, like I said, it's well within their rights and advise the federal government.
Well, in no particular order, I'd like to talk about the introduction of a flat 3% federal personal tax, income tax. And of course, persons earning less than 30,000, that is whether unemployment or not, will pay 100 naira. I'm looking at how feasible is this?
Yeah, thank you, Tolu, for asking that question. So when I saw that in the recommendations, initially I laughed, and then I thought that maybe this is not a laughing matter, right? Because you need to expect that, people who are leading us are more strategic in terms of policy pronouncement. So what the governors have recommended is one, to abolish state income tax and to replace that with, maybe not replace, but to introduce federal income tax of 3% flat rate. And what happens when you introduce a flat rate on income is that that tax becomes regressive. In other words, it will tax poor people more than it will tax the rich people. So it's a lot easier for someone who earns 100 million naira to part with 3%, which is 3 million in a year, than the person who earns only 1 million naira in a whole year. So that is the reason why around the world, personal income tax rates are graduated so that it can be progressive. So I thought it was curious that the governors are recommending the opposite of what the rest of the world is doing. Now, recommending that they should repeal and abolish the state income tax for me also is surprising. Around the world, the number one highest revenue yielding hedge in many countries is personal income tax. But there are countries where they make close to 30-40% of their income from personal income tax alone. South Africa in the last fiscal year made equivalent of 14 trillion naira from personal income tax alone. For so many years, this personal income tax has been entirely within the purview of states. They have never been able to raise 1 trillion naira combined, all 36 states plus the FCT. So this to me seems like an admission of failure to say, since we have not been able to collect the tax from the people, maybe we should just abolish it. And then in place of that, they are proposing that government should then introduce consumption tax, a flat sales tax of about 10% at the state level, and then federal government should increase the VAT from 7.5% to 10, and then later on to 15, and then ultimately to 20. If you add it up, I'm just proposing now that we should be paying consumption tax of about 30% in the very near future. So if you look at all of that recommendation within the context of our economy, the fact that a lot of our people are poor and they're spending all they have on consumption, and you want to increase the consumption tax significantly. I also bear in mind that we have excise, which I think also you said in your introduction, your news recap. We have the excise of 5% coming out on telecommunication. So I do not think that these recommendations are the right recommendations for us now, especially within the context of the structure we have in our economy, where most of our people are poor. Really very interesting. I will be looking forward to maybe more explanation from the governors as to the reasoning behind some of these recommendations.
Big one. Reasons behind some of these recommendations. Let's look at reducing personal cost of MDAs. At the time, the onsite report is always popping up, and that discussion is always at the fore. Now, reducing personnel cost, and on the other hand, cost of governance is something that comes to my mind. Governance seems to be very expensive here in Nigeria, and we seem not to have that capacity to sustain this anymore. Do you think that the governors themselves will look at, what around them, how they can also work this out? Reducing cost of governance is something that I think is very important. How do you see this?
Yes, so this is one area where many Nigerians just said, when you point one finger at another person, at least three other fingers will be facing you. Yes. So one, they said, can we ask people who are 50 years and older to retire compulsorily and pay them off? And then somebody is wondering, governors, why haven't you done it in your own states? You should have done it before and then show the federal government how to do it. And number two, you're talking about the cost of governance. And also, the issues we have are just as bad at the state level as they are at the federal level. In fact, when it comes to transparency, the federal government is a lot more transparent. So which is why some of these issues are always in the people have any idea how they are spending the money and the level of efficiency or lack of it. So if governors want to advise the federal government, they can as well just demonstrate. So they don't need to say, they just do it. Show government the example of how it should be done. Some of the recommendations also I find interesting. On the Orosanya report, where they're saying government should, try and implement the revision that has been made to that report. I thought maybe this is not just a problem with the federal government. Maybe they should also be directing their recommendations to the National Assembly. Because the much I know is that the National Assembly, just over the past few months, have created new agencies, at least 3 or 4. They've created one for NYC fund. They've created another one for Social Security Fund recently. They just kept on creating new funds and new agencies. So the National Assembly needs to come on board. Again, at the state level, the state authorities have to, the governors have to ensure that they also don't create unnecessary agencies. So they have one recommendation that I'm not sure that they have thought about it carefully, or maybe just a question of perspective. So they're also recommending that the federal government should cut constituency projects to National Assembly. But if you think about it, constituency project is how lawmakers get money from the federal government most times to do projects that actually state and local government projects. So in other words, I would have thought that the governors would actually be supportive because that's a way of them getting resources from the center to develop the sub-national. But maybe they just don't trust the lawmakers. Or it could be that they think they are competing with them. Instead of focusing on lawmaking, they start doing projects and commissioning it, which is essentially the work of the executive arm of government.
Let's look at the role central bank has played in all of this. I know we've talked about this before, the initiatives and how well it has impacted the masses. So some will say yes, some will say no. But now the governors are saying that this should be ended and other development banks should be recapitalized to take over all of this or maybe handle some of these initiatives. Do you think anything is wrong with the way that the central bank has, in supporting farmers, supporting the pharmaceutical space, supporting the creative industry, and doing all of this? Do you think that some specialized banks should take over all of these initiatives?
Yeah, on this one, I do agree with the governors. So you cannot have a central bank that is doing everything, right? So there must be a reason why we created the Bank of Agriculture, the Bank of Industry, Development Bank. So, and this is similar to what you find in most parts of the world. You not hear the Federal Reserve in the US trying to do all of these interventions with small businesses, with private sector, promoting export, doing farming and farmers, because the core mandate of the CBN is a lot of work as it is already. Just to keep an eye and control over monetary policy, interest rate, controlling inflation is a lot. So any interventions that are not directly related to this core mandate of the CBN should then be supporting the other structures that have been created to carry out this mandate. Because in many cases, those other structures are more enabled, they are more experienced, they have better capacity to get the job done than the central bank. So I do agree that the central bank needs to start, moving away from having to do everything, almost like running a whole government, to just focusing on their core mandates and supporting the other organizations and platforms that have been established to do the various interventions to focus on those interventions. That way, we can hold everybody to account in terms of their mandate and what they're doing. Because what's going to happen is the CBN is pretty much doing all of those things, carrying the overhead, and you still have those other platforms with people that are being paid for maybe not doing enough or not doing anything. So what that means is overall, the overhead as a country is going up, and that's impacting again on the cost of governance.
So let's wrap up almost on this note. Worst case scenario, if we continue like this, business as usual, what will be the state of things? Particularly, I think some say the governors are worried because at the point, the capacity to even pay salaries or execute projects might be might be an issue. So do you think that if we continue this way, or what do you think would happen if we continue this way?
Yeah, so maybe the biggest worry of all the issues that the governors are trying to address, or at least advise the federal government to address, for me would be one is subsidy. The first subsidy is, in my view, is getting out of hand if it's not already out of hand. We are easily looking at 6 trillion for next year. It's likely going to be more. For an economy where even your revenue is barely that amount, if you take out oil revenue and you focus on non-oil. The second one is, I think the finance minister, indicated recently that the cost of servicing our debt alone for this year is going to be over 6 trillion. So imagine 6 trillion going to debt service, another 6 trillion or thereabout going into subsidy. That's 12 trillion in a country where you cannot find money to pay lecturers to be back to classes, where you cannot take care of infrastructure sufficiently. And when you can't, there's so many things that we are struggling to do, and then this is where the money is going. Plus, if you then consider the oil theft, where some estimates have almost 400,000 barrels per day that we are losing. At this time, when the price of crude oil is very high in the international market, and we should be benefiting, but rather we are going through the pains of countries that do not produce oil, and then we are not benefiting from the gains of oil-producing economies. So I think these are the fundamental areas, but I don't think it's the federal government alone to do it. When the NNPC does under recovery to cover subsidy, it's actually essentially a federation matter, not federal government. So this is actually their joint responsibility. They can't be pushing it to the federal government alone. They need to address the problem jointly together. But in any case, they need to find money to pay salaries. Otherwise, we're going to have a social crisis closer to home on our hand than we ever envisaged.
Well, it's a good way to live it. Interesting conversation as usual. I've been speaking to Mr. Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much. I do enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much for having me.